Lynn Lewis, seen outside London Appeal Court, tried to stop the house in Tewkesbury from being transferred to wealthy 91-year-old Thomas Warner, who had lived there for 19 years. A woman has lost a legal bid to have her late mother's frail and elderly partner removed from the home they shared for 2 decades. Lynn Lewis tried to stop the house in Tewkesbury from being transferred to wealthy 91-year-old Thomas Warner, who had lived there for 19 years with Audrey Blackwell before her death in 2014. Mrs. Lewis went to the Court of Appeal in London in the hope of reversing an earlier ruling which allowed Mr. Warner, who has lived in the Gloucestershire village all of his life, to stay in the house and buy it for £385,000. But, in a ruling delivered on Wednesday, Sir Geoffrey Voss dismissed her case and said the decision to hand the property to Mr. Warner, given his age and poor health, was a sensible pragmatic solution. The court heard Mr. Warner started living with Mrs. Blackwell in 1995 and they remained together until her death, with him contributing to the running costs of their home. Mr. Warner, who suffers from a range of health problems, had a friendly relationship with Mrs. Lewis and her husband before Mrs. Blackwell's death, but this deteriorated as a result of the legal action. He told a previous hearing he would be very unhappy and stressed if he had to move from the house where he had spent the happiest 20 years of his life. Mrs. Lewis had said she wanted to put the house on the market and was willing to sell to the highest bidder, including Mr. Warner, if he was that person. Mrs. Lewis went to the Court of Appeal in London in the hope of reversing an earlier ruling which allowed Mr. Warner, who has lived in the Gloucestershire village all of his life, to stay in the house, pictured, and buy it for £385,000. Describing him as a trespasser, she said he had no need to live in the house paid for by her hard-working parents. Her lawyers argued at the appeal hearing earlier this month that Mr. Warner was not entitled to have the property transferred to him because he was not in need of any financial provision from Mrs. Blackwell's will. But Sir Geoffrey ruled the transfer was entirely permissible and indeed appropriate. Sitting with Lord Justice M. Seacombe and Lady Justice Asplin, he added, "No doubt, had Mr. Warner been younger and less infirm when the deceased died, he would indeed have been required to move out of the property and buy himself another one, as he could well have afforded to do. But here, the judge plainly thought that requiring him to do so, in all the actual circumstances pertaining at the time of the hearing, should be avoided. Even if Mrs. Blackwell had made a conscious decision to leave him nothing, she may not have been aware of how old and infirm he would be when she died. This is not a matter of what might have been sensible or desirable. It is a matter of Mr. Warner's objectively assessed needs," the judge said. The absence of a moral obligation was outweighed by what was required to preserve the status quo for a very old and infirm person. The house is at the heart of the village where Mr. Blackwell grew up and he lives next door to a doctor who looks out for him.